joined today by Laura Dimino, Assistant Director of the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. For those who may not be familiar, can you tell us a bit about your organization?
Certainly. We are a legislative agency, and we basically work for the General Assembly of Pennsylvania. We collect data, do research, and fund research on anything related to rural conditions, needs, and policies, and we provide that information to the legislature in order to inform the policy process.
Can you describe what some parts of Pennsylvania that are considered rural are like?
Certainly, yeah. So we have our own definition of rural, which we have had in place for decades and continue to use. And basically, we divide counties and municipalities according to their population density. So roughly speaking, I would say about 3/4 of the state of our 67 counties are classified as rural, and 25% are urban. And in terms of the total population, as you know, rural areas are more sparsely populated. So we've got about 25%, just over 3 million people living in our rural areas, whereas roughly 3/4 of the population is in 19 urban counties. So generally our rural counties are more, sparsely populated. A lot of our agricultural land is in the rural counties, although we even find that in some of our urban counties as well, such as Lancaster, which we classify as urban, does have a lot of agricultural land as well. So that's not the defining characteristic, but tends to be more in rural areas.
Your office recently released a study on emergency food supply and distribution in rural Pennsylvania. Why did you feel like that was important?
Yeah, I think this was a topic that we put on our RFP, or request for proposals, a couple years in a row. And we were very happy to see that one of our faculty researchers wanted to do that project in 2023. This is one of the services that we think is very important. Of course, during COVID, this emerged as an important issue, but hunger throughout the Commonwealth and the United States remains an ongoing issue.
How big of a problem is it for people in rural Pennsylvania to not have access? How many people do not have access to food?
That is a really good question. So when we started this study, I imagined, with these great researchers, that we would find out the answer to that question. And the best we can do actually is to estimate that. So on an annual basis, the federal government does an estimate, but in addition, some of the larger food banks within the Commonwealth also need to do their own estimates. So it is very difficult to get an exact number at any given time. Our best estimates are that it's probably somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population. We think, based on what we know and hear from food pantries that were interviewed in this report, that in rural areas that number is a little bit higher. So probably around 10-11% in urban areas and a little bit higher in the rural areas.
Why do you think it's higher in the rural areas?
That's a good question. Part of it is probably age distribution. So the Commonwealth right now has an aging population, as does the region and the country. But particularly in our rural counties, we have older adults outnumbering younger. Mm-hmm. The Commonwealth across the board has some low birth rates as well. So we've got a lot of people dispersed throughout rural areas, and it can be very difficult for them to access things via transportation as people age. If they have disability issues, we find that they may have difficulties accessing a hub or where a food bank or food pantry may be. And it's just a matter of distance. So Pennsylvania, if you ever drive across it, is a very big state. And so you might imagine, how big could it be? But it is difficult for some food banks and pantries to provide access to everyone equally across those vast areas.
What options do people currently living in rural Pennsylvania have for food distribution?
So, at the county level, we have food distribution of various sorts. So sometimes we imagine that, there's a system or entire plan that works the same in every area of the state, but that isn't the case. So there are a number of federal programs and state programs that contribute to helping solve the hunger issues and food insecurity throughout Pennsylvania. So the Department of Agriculture, for example, at the national and state level play a role in providing both funding and commodities to share with food banks to distribute outward. But it really depends on the county in which a person lives. So some counties are served by a single county food bank. Others, such as the central part of the state, are served by a bank. And then that has, if you will, some other organizations that it distributes food out to and helps distribute it. So it really depends where you live.
What did this study find at all?
Well, I mean, the study found a number of things. I think one of the more important ones is that there is inequality across the Commonwealth. So there's a wonderful figure in the report, which is available on our website. I think it's figure 5, and it just does a quick visual of how many pounds of food are available by recipient across each county. And each county is also categorized by need. And we can see that in some areas of the state, it's a lot easier to access a higher quantity of food as well as a higher quality of food. So we have to be mindful of those inequities and differences across the state. And a number of food banks and pantries are trying their very best to help recipients with that. Another finding is that even though we have a large number of residents in the state taking advantage of these programs, and they're very grateful and positive about these services, over half of them are still facing food insecurity. And the study was able to interview some service recipients, and they reported that, again, slightly over half the time they either go hungry or go without a meal, or don't eat as much as they would like to eat in order to stretch out that food supply.
Lastly, what do you think can be done to fix this distribution issue with the rural Pennsylvania?
Right. So the report has a number of recommendations. So for anyone really interested in this policy area, I would suggest getting a hold of it and looking at it again on our website. Some of them have to do with recommendations about federal programs. So some of the federal programs that are designed to help deal with food insecurity are administered by the state, and the state has some flexibility in how it does that. So for example, with regard to guidelines, a lot of these programs are set up such that a recipient has to be within a certain income level, and those are based off the federal poverty line. But a large number of people and households who do need access to food don't necessarily meet those poverty standards. So one way to help with that is to stretch those out to make it a little more lenient. Because if a person or a household or family is coming to a food pantry, they're doing so oftentimes reluctantly. But a lot of recipients don't quite meet those guidelines. I think another recommendation would be to help streamline, as always, bureaucracy, right? But imagine, you're working at a food bank or food pantry, and all of the food supply that you have comes in with different requirements. You have to figure out if your recipients meet the requirements. So there's a lot of logistics on the ground. So one thing that Pennsylvania doesn't do, but might consider, is streamlining that, such that if a household or family qualified for one program, such as SNAP, they would qualify for other programs at the same time. And right now, there's a lot of paperwork and needing to apply for multiple things. So those are a couple of the things the report points to.
Laura Dimino, Assistant Director of the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, thank you for your time.
Thank you.